반갑습니다. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ham Jae-bong. I'm the president of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. I'll be your host for the next 3 days. Thank you so much for being here. I apologize for those of you still standing in the back. A few more people showed up than we had expected, but we'll get you some chairs very soon. Thank you all for coming all the way out here. We have 210 experts coming from abroad. Some 65 diplomatic corps is represented. And of course, scores of Korean experts will also be joining us for the next 3 days. The topic, I guess I don't think I really need to tell you about the significance of it, and I think the appropriateness of actually holding this in this particular location. So enjoy our hospitality. As our motto says, you bring a lot of incredible wealth of insights. I hope we can provide the forum in which you can connect those insights and for us to come up with some real solutions to some of the most intractable and difficult issues that confront us and that will deeply affect our nuclear future. With that, I would like to now introduce the chairwoman of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, Dr. Lee In-ho.
Good afternoon. Minister Kim Song-hwan, Your Excellencies, and distinguished participants. It is a great privilege for me to welcome, on behalf of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, so many of the world's leading experts and authorities on nuclear issues. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to come to share your wisdom and concern on an issue for which finding the right resolution is vital to the destiny of the human race. Since many of you are not familiar yet with the name Asan Institute, please allow me to take a moment to explain what our institute stands for. Asan, sometimes suspected of being a typographical error for Asian by some of our international specialist friends, is the endearing pen name of the late Mr. Chung Ju-young, the founder of Hyundai Group. The Asan Institute for Policy Study was launched 3 years ago with the generous support of one of his sons, Mr. Chung Mong-jun, who currently is a 6th-term National Assemblyman of Korea, for the purpose of carrying on the spirit of the late Mr. Chung's lifelong dedication to enhancing prosperity and peace on the Korean Peninsula. The Asan Institute strives to fulfill its mandate by addressing the most critical problems faced by the Korean nation and Northeast Asia region as a whole, being aware that no major problem in this world today can be resolved without active participation and cooperation from the entire global community. The Asan Institute actively engages itself in policy development, non-governmental diplomacy, and the training of experts in the area of national security, foreign relations, training of and governance and public policy as well. Currently, the research staff is comprised of 8 PhD-holding senior researchers, 7 junior researchers, several visiting scholars, and numerous undergraduate interns. We are living in a world where the ability to understand, communicate, and sympathize with peoples belonging to different cultures is becoming just as critical as expert analysis of particular problems. As President Kennedy pointed out half a century ago, the development of the instruments of war far outpaces the development of the instruments of peace. The time allowed us to reverse this dangerous situation is short. Responding to the changing needs of our times, the Asan Institute is also interested in promoting dialogue among civilizations. The most recent Asan Memorial Lecture was given by Tu Wei-ming on the topic of the modern interpretation of Confucianism. As you know, Tu Wei-ming is now working in China after his retirement from the faculty of Harvard University. The Asan Plenum, entitled Our Nuclear Future, is the first ever such international conference of such a scale to be undertaken by our institute. It was planned with a view to assisting the second Nuclear Security Summit scheduled to take place in Seoul in March of next year, to produce the kind of result which we all so desperately await. Although the plenum was conceived long before the disaster which struck our neighbor Japan this past spring, the time and place for a World Forum on Nuclear Issues could not have been more appropriately taken. As those of us gathered here are all too aware, the outcome of the Security Summit cannot exceed the level of expertise and wisdom found among the community of those who deal with the issues day and night. In this sense, what the participants here come up with at the end of this plenum will have a direct and enormous impact upon the degree of success the World Summit next year will have. Once again, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all those who made this plenum possible, especially our Ministry of Foreign Affairs for its generous support, and the organizing committee of the Asan Institute, headed by Dr. Ham Jae-bong, who had to make many trips around the world to consult with colleagues who agreed with him on the desirability of holding such a preliminary summit of the experts. Here we are, gathered together to deal with a force which can either be the good fairy's magic wand in the service of humanity or turn into the bad witch's curse. I sincerely hope that by the end of this plenum, each of the participants can return home with a sense of pride and gratification that by pooling our resources, we have personally contributed to helping to reassure that nuclear power will remain the magic wand we all want it to be and not degenerate into the witch's curse. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ino. Now I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing to you our keynote speaker, the Honorable Kim Sung-hwan, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade of the Republic of Korea. Minister Kim, please.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lee In-ho and Dr. Ham Jae-bong. It is my privilege and honor to speak at the Asan Plenum. I greatly welcome the holding of this event, which is the first of its kind to gather experts from Korea and abroad to engage in an in-depth and comprehensive exchange of views on a single theme. The initiation of such a forum in Korea, I believe, is timely and significant given the huge challenges we are facing in the nuclear field. My understanding is that this plenum will focus on 5 topics under the theme of our nuclear future, namely non-proliferation, disarmament, peaceful use, nuclear security and deterrence. I'm confident that we'll all benefit from the diverse range of perspectives presented and that the outcomes will greatly contribute to preparing for the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit to be held next March. Distinguished guests, the earthquake and tsunami that hit the northeastern region of Japan in March and the ensuing Fukushima nuclear accident and the radiological leak vividly illustrate the two contrasting faces of nuclear energy. Until that incident, many predicted that the advent of a nuclear renaissance with a growing number of nuclear power plants, more than 300 are known to be under construction or are planned to be constructed by 2030. The Republic of Korea is recognized by many as an exemplary country in its use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. In 1977, Korea became the 21st country in the world to construct a civilian nuclear power plant, the Gori No. 1, 15 years after it adopted the Trigger Mark II, a research reactor. Since then, our nuclear industry has made great strides, reflecting our economic growth over the 40 years that followed. Korea currently operates 21 nuclear power plants with an additional 7 under construction. We have plans to increase that number to 34 by 2024. Nuclear energy will be responsible for producing nearly half of our electricity by the mid-2020s compared to the figure of 31.4% today. With our advanced technology and extensive experience of the safe operation of power plants, we are now an exporter of nuclear power plants. There may be many divergent views on the future of nuclear energy, especially in light of the Fukushima accident. Yet, we should learn from this experience and turn crisis into opportunity, just as the Chernobyl accident in 1986 served to catalyze major reforms in international norms on nuclear safety. Nuclear energy needs to continue to play a vital role in facilitating low-carbon green growth in a way that balances protection of the environment and economic development. It is a key to solving the two most important challenges the world faces today, climate change and energy shortage. Distinguished guests, Korea is fully aware of the fact that the right to the peaceful use of energy brings with it non-proliferation obligations. As is clearly stated in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear disarmament, and the peaceful use of nuclear energy constitute the three pillars of the NPT and cannot addressed separately. As a non-nuclear weapon state, the Republic of Korea has fully complied with its non-proliferation obligations and has actively joined in international non-proliferation efforts. In this vein, I reaffirm that the 4 principles on the peaceful use of nuclear energy that my government declared in 2004 still stand firm today. The 4 principles are as follows. The Korean government has no intention of developing or possessing nuclear weapons. Number 2, the Korean government will firmly maintain its principle of nuclear transparency and strengthen its cooperation with the international community to this end. Number 3, the Korean government will faithfully abide by international agreements on nuclear non-proliferation. Number 4, the Korean government will expand its peaceful use of nuclear energy with the confidence of the international community. The IAEA publicly confirmed that Korea's nuclear activities are conducted in a peaceful way by drawing a broad conclusion in 2008. Korea is also actively participating in the international efforts to counter the proliferation of WMD. It is an active member of all major export control regimes, including the PSI, which we officially joined in 2009. Distinguished guests, in sharp contrast, North Korea has taken actions which undermine the very basis of the NPT regime. It has abandoned its obligations under the NPT by abusing the right to the peaceful use of nuclear energy in order to develop nuclear weapons. the Republic of Korea government has been patiently exerting efforts to realize the denuclearization of North Korea. But North Korea has not yet shown any sincere change in its attitude toward denuclearization, and the threat posed by North Korea's nuclear capabilities has grown more serious than ever. North Korea continues to develop its nuclear program despite the sanctions imposed by the United Nations Security Council. It conducted nuclear tests in 2006 and 2009, violated agreements of the six-party talks by reversing the disablement conducted at the Yongbyon nuclear facility, and internationally revealed its uranium enrichment program last November. Furthermore, suspicions of North Korea's nuclear proliferation activities, such as its collaboration with Syria, are constantly raised by the international community. North Korea refuses to take any responsible measure for the series of provocations it has made. Rather, its behavior has been simply irrational. Not long after it stated its willingness to return to the six-party talks without preconditions and discuss its UEP, just last week, after Kim Jong-il returned from China, North Korea declared that it would no longer deal with the Korean government and threatened to launch an all-out military retaliation. Such pattern of behavior has been repeatedly demonstrated by North Korea. It has tended to first make provocations, such as launching missiles or conducting nuclear tests, then attempt to establish its actions as a fait accompli and seek to make bargains on this basis. If that attempt fails, then resort to military threats to extract concessions. We are determined not to condone North Korea's tactics of brinkmanship any longer. It follows that while there are high expectations for the resumption of the six-party talks, we believe that the six-party talks should be resumed when they can yield substantive progress rather than being held merely for the sake of dialogue. North Korea must demonstrate its sincerity toward denuclearization through concrete actions and thereby restore the trust of the international community prior to the resumption of the six-party talks. In this regard, I would like to emphasize that the door to dialogue is always open for North Korea. My government proposed an inter-Korean dialogue on denuclearization in January. The five parties are in agreement to create appropriate circumstances for the resumption of the six-party talks through various contexts with inter-Korean dialogue as an essential first step. Despite recent provocative statements by North Korea, my government will continue to take a calm and resolute posture while continuing our unwavering pursuit of dialogue with North Korea. The ministers at the Asan Foreign Ministers meeting, which I attended last week, underlined the importance of a sincere and constructive inter-Korean dialogue. I believe this represents the international community's broad support for the Korean government's efforts to induce positive change in North Korea's behavior toward denuclearization, starting with inter-Korean dialogue. It is also essential to clearly define North Korea's UEP as illegal before discussing the issue at the six-party talks. As long as North Korea continues to assert that its UEP is for peaceful purposes, the six-party talks are bound to be caught up in time-consuming debates on the legitimacy and the legality of North Korea's UEP. The resumption of the talks would then be utterly fruitless. This is why the international community needs to clearly state in a unified voice that North Korea's UEP is inconsistent with the 2005 joint statement and is a violation of UN Security Council resolutions 1718 and 1874. Just as the leaders of the G8 recently condemned it as a violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Meanwhile, North Korea's nuclear program also gives rise to concerns from a safety perspective. The recent nuclear accident in Japan clearly demonstrates that the dangers stemming from the North Korean nuclear issue are twofold: threats to the peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and in the Northeast Asian region, as well as economic and environmental threats to the region and the world. As it is highly likely that North Korea's nuclear facilities are not commensurate with international safety standards, the safety of North Korea's nuclear programs should be given more attention by the international community and should be treated as a key agenda in future six-party talks. North Korea should meet its people's wish for a better future and respond to the international community's call for denuclearization. To improve inter-Korean relations, North Korea needs to demonstrate responsible behavior concerning the Cheonan and Yeonpyeong issues, which is acceptable to the Korean people. It is my sincere hope that North Korea may respond to our proposal for inter-Korean dialogue as soon as possible as a first step toward that end. Distinguished guests, on the Korean Peninsula, there are two very different countries, the Republic of Korea, a model country in its peaceful use of nuclear energy and an active participant in international non-proliferation efforts, and the DPRK that undermines the very basis of the NPT regime by developing nuclear weapons. I believe this stark contrast clearly illuminates the direction in which we need to be heading in our nuclear future, which is the topic of this plenum. Against this backdrop, we appreciate the significance of the next Nuclear Security Summit, which will be held in Seoul, 26th and 27th March next year. The Korean government believes that the Seoul Summit holds great significance for the following reasons. First, for Korea, hosting the Nuclear Security Summit means engagement in the overall trends of the post-Cold War era, in particular, post-September 11 international security discussions. Nuclear terrorism is one of the most serious threats to international security, considering the devastating consequences it would have on the global economy and beyond, regardless of where it takes place. It is said that one should be prepared for the worst-case scenario with regard to security issues. In this sense, we should not neglect or address even the slightest possibility of nuclear terrorism. In a globalized world in which countries are more mutually dependent than ever, nuclear terrorism is not a problem solely for the West. It is a common challenge from which even Korea is not immune. Second, the fact that Korea was chosen as host of the second Nuclear Security Summit serves to demonstrate Korea's increasing role in the international fora. It may be seen as recognition by the international community of the responsible role Korea has played in supporting non-proliferation principles and leading green growth against global climate change. It can also be seen as recognition of Korea's role as a bridge between developed and developing countries in solving major global issues, as demonstrated by last year's G20 Seoul Summit. Korea will play a bridging role in the nuclear field as well, between nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states, and between states with advanced nuclear energy industries and those with developing industries. Third, the 2012 Seoul Summit will strengthen the nuclear security regime by expanding the scope of discussions, building upon the achievements of the Washington Summit. While we will have to consult with participating countries, we plan to address the issue of securing radioactive sources more comprehensively. Although the destructive impact of radiological terrorism using dirty bombs is much weaker than that of nuclear terrorism, appropriate management in safely securing radioactive sources is vital, given the higher probability, relative ease, and enormous psychological effect of radiological terrorism. In addition, there is an ever-growing need to address the issue of nuclear safety within the context of the Nuclear Security Summit in light of the recent developments as a result of the Fukushima nuclear accident. Nuclear security and nuclear safety need to be enhanced in a mutually reinforcing way, considering the fact that the consequences of a terrorist attack on a nuclear facility may be equivalent to a nuclear accident. The Seoul Summit aims to address the interface between the two. Lastly, the year 2012 is a highly significant year both for the Korean Peninsula and beyond. It is the centennial of the birth of Kim Il-sung and the year in which North Korea has pledged to turn itself into a strong and prosperous country. It is also a year in which there will be changes in the global leadership, not only in the Republic of Korea, but also in the United States, Russia, and China. By bringing world leaders to Seoul to discuss key international security issues, the 2012 summit will send out a strong message on renewing the importance of maintaining peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and pursuing the denuclearization of North Korea. I look forward to insightful and constructive debates over the next 3 days and would like to wish you every success in ensuring highly fruitful outcomes from the Asan Plenum. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Kim. We will now quickly move into our first plenary session, World Free of Nuclear Weapons, a bold dream or a reality in the making. And I would now like to invite the three panelists and our moderator up to the podium. Our moderator will be Mr. David Sanger, the Washington Bureau Chief of the New York Times. And our moderator will be Dr. Lee Hong-gu, former Prime Minister, Dr. Han Sung-ju, former Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea, and Dr. Edwin Fulner of the Heritage Foundation. So please.
Here we are again.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Ham Chae-bung, for having us all here today. You've assembled quite a collection of nuclear expertise, and it's wonderful to be here and back in Seoul and to be with this great panel. I'm David Sanger. I'm the Chief Washington Correspondent for the New York Times. And as you heard, we've got Dr. Lee Hong-gu, the former Prime Minister, Dr. Han Sung-ju, who was former Minister of Foreign Affairs and also served as ambassador in Washington, and Dr. Edward Fulner, who's the president and the CEO of the Heritage Foundation. And so I think the way we'll proceed is this. We're going to ask each of the three to speak briefly. I'm going to ask them a few questions as each one of them finishes. Then we'll open up to a conversation among the four of us here for a bit, and then open it up to all of you for questions. Let's start with Lee Hong-gu, if we could. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sango. I join everybody in welcoming friends from all over the world. Let me just say that as the nuclear summit next year approaches, and as we have this plenum, we have a real sense of urgency in terms of the nuclear threat we face on the peninsula. There's only one country which actually suffered nuclear weapons. Back in 1945, as you remember, the atomic bomb was dropped in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. With one small bomb in Hiroshima, approximately 250,000 people suffered. Of those 250,000 people, about 10% were Koreans, because many Korean workers were taken there to work in the ammunition factories in the Hiroshima area. What I'm saying is that for us, and certainly for Japanese, the question of a nuclear weapon is not something abstract. It's real, and by all means we want to avoid it. I served as a unification minister twice, and spending much of my time on that issue. But I could say categorically, if it's a choice between another war and unification, we'll rather postpone unification and avoid a war, which may involve nuclear weapons. So that's the kind of sense of urgency we have. We got to work. We got to do something quick, joining all the available forces together. And we have a great expectation from the nuclear summit next year. And I also would like to get a valuable contribution from this plenum, collecting all the insights. As you know, this concern is global. And in the United States, some of our friends, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Bill Perry, and the Senator Sam Nunn, they together, so-called four wise men, have persistently argued and sent various appeals to the media to do something about this issue. And there have been a great deal of response around the world. In Korea, my colleague, Dr. Han Sung-ju, General Baek Sun-yeop, the hero of the Korean War, and Mr. Park Kwan-young, the speaker, former speaker of our parliament, four of us joined and in this trend tried to emphasize the need to do something and to stop this trend of proliferation. So there will be a number of issues the plenum we're going to discuss in the next 2.5 days. But I just wanted to emphasize how important this issue is to the Koreans. Let me just remind you that nearly 20 years ago, in 1991, North and South discussed the issue. And we signed a joint declaration to keep the Korean Peninsula nuclear free. And it was duly promulgated in February 1992. What we are asking, and I think the international community agrees with us, asking North Korea is, please go back to that agreement. And let's keep it, because that's the best way to keep 75 million Koreans on the peninsula safe. And not only us, but people in our region, and indeed, people around the world. So I expect a great deal from this plenum. And let me just end my remark here. Thank you very much.
Prime Minister Lee, I'll just ask one question coming from that before we go on and hear from your colleague and old friend Han Sung-ju. You said at one point during your talk just now that if you had to make the choice between war and delaying unification, you would choose, of course, to delay unification. I'm wondering whether or not you think at this point that really is the choice, or whether there is any kind of middle ground of gradual absorption of the North that you see could happen in this difficult transition time that you're through. And if that was the case, since we heard from the foreign minister that South Korea's got no interest in developing or possessing nuclear weapons, if the North was absorbed by the South, what is the South Korean plan for dealing with those weapons?
First of all, we are not interested in absorbing North Korea. We have coexisted as different entities for more than half a century. And earlier I mentioned the joint declaration of 1992. In 1991, both ourselves and North Korea had joined the United Nations. So the foremost objective we have is, first of all, to maintain peace in the peninsula. Now, related to your question, we all seek peaceful unification, but if you emphasize peace alone, it almost is emphasizing status quo. There's no war at the moment. So however dangerous the situation may be, if you just continue this situation indefinitely, that may be all right for many of the concerned powers. In fact, that is the case at the moment. But for Koreans, it's a highly unusual situation. We've been divided for 66 years. The division was not a product of our choice. It's a decision of great powers, the victorious powers of the Second World War. In any case, the middle ground you mentioned is that while we keep peace, there are ways still move towards unification. And also work together to avoid the danger of war, and particularly the danger of nuclear war. That's why we signed that joint declaration. And that's why our unification formula is not to observe one part by the other, but to form a, to use English expressions, sort of commonwealth or union. If the European countries, different sovereign countries, could form a European Union, surely people who have lived together for thousands of years could do something. I think Koreans are smart enough to do this. So we still maintain hope that one way or another we can persuade and pressure North Korea to come along. North Koreans changed their mind after that declaration, saying that their security was endangered. If that's the case, we have to produce some sort of solution, maybe through six-party talks, to ensure the security of North Korea in a sense. No one wants to invade North Korea. So we like to move forward along that line. But first of all, North Korea has to make up its mind that by threatening South Korea, by threatening the peace in the region, by threatening the global balance of power, by developing nuclear weapons, it doesn't help North Korea, it doesn't help Koreans, it doesn't help anybody. And I hope in next year's nuclear summit and gathering like this will further mobilize global wisdom and global resolution to pressure and to ask and to plead North Korea to come along. I hope this will happen.
Thank you very much. Dr. Han.
Thank you. Let me start with an introduction of the statement four of our colleagues made in June last year on a world free of nuclear weapons. In the statement, we expressed appreciation to the initiatives taken by four U.S. senior statesmen, Henry Kissinger, Sam Nunn, William Perry, and George Shultz, on behalf of a world free of nuclear weapons, and President Barack Obama's historic Prague speech in April 2009, in which he emphasized America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. Our support for these efforts is directly related to the grim reality we face in Korea and the vision of the Korean Peninsula without nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapons programs in North Korea constitute a serious danger to peace and stability in this region and undermine the credibility and effectiveness of the NPT regime. North Korea's nuclear weapons programs, along with those of other potential proliferators, highlight the fact that the world is now on the precipice of a new and dangerous nuclear era. we stated our views on how to achieve the goal of a free world free of nuclear weapons as follows. First, the NPT, the foremost global non-proliferation regime comprising both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states, should be strengthened and reinforced. In order to meet the challenges of the post-Cold War era, the NPT should be implemented in good faith and with urgent action taken in all three pillars of the basic bargain: nuclear arms reduction, non-proliferation, and peaceful use of nuclear energy. Second, the United States and Russia, two nuclear weapon states with the largest nuclear arsenals, should continue to accelerate substantial arms reduction, while other nuclear weapon states join the negotiations in due course. This requires a new mindset on the utility of nuclear weapons and strong political will of the leaders to translate it into concrete actions. Third, another urgent task in the multilateral arena is to bring into force the 1996 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, a core element of the international nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime, as soon as possible. We strongly encourage the United States to accelerate the ratification process of the CTBT so that other remaining states will follow suit. Fourth, another important task consists of halting the production of fissile material for weapons globally and removing them. In this context, we endorse the outcome of the NPT Review Conference, which urged the Conference on Disarmament, CD, to immediately start negotiations on FMCT, Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. Fifth, we join the call by the international community for efforts to promote universal adherence to the NPT and to apply IAEA comprehensive safeguards in all peaceful nuclear activities. In this regard, we also urge North Korea to return to the NPT as soon as possible and to faithfully comply with the IAEA Safeguards Agreement. Sixth, we welcome the communique of the 2010 Washington Nuclear Security Summit and its work plan, and its decision to hold the 2012 Nuclear Security Summit in Korea. We also endorse the series of recommendations adopted by the 2010 NPT Review Conference. Seventh, we take note of the fact that the NPT Review Conference in May emphatically reaffirmed the right to use nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, taking into account the particular needs of the developing countries to receive international support and IAEA technical cooperation. Civilian nuclear energy programs should benefit those in need without the risk of proliferation, nuclear terrorism, or nuclear accidents. Last but not least, we should redouble our efforts to resolve regional problems and conflicts that prompt countries to aspire to be nuclear weapon states. We also join the call by the NPT Review Conference urging North Korea to fulfill its commitments under the six-party talks in accordance with the September 2005 joint statement and to return to the NPT. This Asan Nuclear Forum covers a whole range of subjects, including nuclear reduction, safety, security, safeguards, deterrence, and peaceful use. A major difficulty in achieving the various policy objectives in these subject areas is the fact that they often appear as incompatible, even contradictory with one another. In the Northeast Asian region, for example, America's commitment to extended nuclear deterrence has given reassurance to its allies, Japan and South Korea, about protection and retaliation in case of attack. It has also had the desired effect of dissuading them from building nuclear weapons themselves and has probably prevented smaller-scale conflicts from escalating into larger ones. However, extended deterrence has been either unsuccessful or counterproductive in two critical areas. preventing small-scale conventional provocations and proliferation by adversaries, in this case, North Korea. The proliferating party uses extended deterrence as a justification for the act of proliferation. But regardless of their rationale, proliferators proliferate for purposes that go beyond deterrence. For one thing, the irony of deterrence is that one's deterrence is strengthened when the other's deterrence is weakened or nullified. Thus, North Korea would wish to gain greater freedom to perpetrate hostile acts by acquiring its own nuclear capability. North Korea would also believe that with nuclear weapons, it could cross the red line, including conventional provocations without fear of military punishment. Failing states such as North Korea also believe that nuclear weapons are necessary for their regime survival. They believe and argue that the United States attacked Iraq because it did not have nuclear weapons, and NATO intervened in Libya militarily because Libya had given up nuclear programs. Another dilemma is that with the reduction of nuclear weapons by some states, it tends to increase their premium and value with other states, be they existing nuclear states or new proliferators. We also need to pay attention to the problem that with nuclear proliferation, there is an increase in danger to nuclear safety and security. First, as proliferation is perpetrated without international monitoring and inspections, there is greater danger of nuclear accidents and disasters. Second, as we have seen in the suspected collaboration between North Korea and Pakistan, and between Syria and North Korea, proliferation increases in the possibility of illicit transfer. Third, with a proliferator such as North Korea with economic difficulties, there's a greater temptation to sell nuclear material, equipment, and technology to other parties, be they state or non-state actors. Our colleagues in the International Committee on Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Disarmament, ICNND, warned us in their latest report as follows, and I quote, "Maintaining the status quo is not an option. The threats and risks associated with the failure to persuade existing nuclear-armed states to disarm, to prevent new states from acquiring nuclear weapons, to stop any terrorist actor from gaining access to such weapons, and to properly manage a rapid expansion in civil nuclear energy, defy complacency. We believe that now is the right time to act and carry the momentum of non-proliferation and disarmament forward." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Han, for that wonderful survey of where we are. Let me hone in on one element of what you said, and I'm sure we'll come back to this some in the greater conversation later on. You mentioned the contradiction that at the very time that we have major states signing on to this concept of a world without nuclear weapons, even if it is a point far in the future, you've got smaller states that are building up, Iran, North Korea, Pakistan, obviously, India as well. And you alluded to the lesson that the North Koreans have pulled out of recent events. Libya was an example of a country that did give up its nuclear weapons program and all elements of it. And the North Koreans were quite explicit just a month or so ago in making the point that had they not given those weapons up, they might not be suffering daily bombings at the hands of NATO. So my question is, do you believe that right now the United States, among other countries, maybe the Europeans as well, are undercutting their own program on moving toward a world without nuclear weapons? that the kind of experience that Libya is going through is going to send just the opposite message. And how do you counter that? We haven't heard public officials discuss it very much.
When North Korea insinuated that nuclear weapons are important in defending their own system and their regime, we would point out that the Soviet Union, with thousands of nuclear weapons, could not prevent the Soviet Empire or the Soviet Union itself from disintegrating. We didn't foresee that in cases like Iraq or now Libya, there is the possible argument that if they had nuclear weapons, the outside powers would have thought twice before intervening militarily. I don't know if North Korea was thinking about that possibility even then, but clearly this has given North Korea an added ammunition in their argument in favor of maintaining their nuclear program. Muammar Gaddafi's sister, a daughter in fact, Aisha Gaddafi, in her interview with the New York Times actually said exactly that, which is that the lessons from Libya is that countries which have nuclear weapons should keep them, and which don't have should secure them. And North Korea cannot agree more strongly with that kind of a statement. But this, I don't think, should be a consideration when the United States or the European countries or other countries debate or consider whether there has to be a military intervention on behalf of humanitarian goals, because this will be giving an added argument and rationale to the proliferator, but certainly the absence of it, that is, by refraining from military intervention to the countries which had given up nuclear weapons, it will not encourage these countries from giving up their nuclear weapons.
Good. I hope during the general conversation we can come back to this, because it certainly is a potent policy issue that is underway in Washington now. Dr. Fulner runs one of the largest and most respected think tanks in Washington, the Heritage Foundation, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, as the first international speaker today, I would like to express on behalf of all of us our very special appreciation to you, Madam Chair Lee, to you, Dr. Ham, for the incredible logistical and facilitating work you have done in pulling this whole plenum together in such relatively short order. It's really wonderful, and it's our great pleasure to be here as your guests and to be able to share ideas with each other. And in fact, I think in some respects, that's one of the things that makes this so special for me, is that you have assembled individuals not only from governmental entities, but individuals from think tanks around the world. And I commend you especially for doing that. So, kamsahamnida. I would only say also, as one who has been visiting Korea for a very long time, that to see those early pictures of Asan, of Chung Ju-young, and remembering and knowing him, as I had the great pleasure of doing, from the time that he introduced a kind of clunky little car called the Pony to the United States, to the point where Hyundai today is one of the most widely respected manufacturers of automobiles in the United States. and also thinking about the vision of him herding cattle across the 38th parallel in his own kind of personal public diplomacy, and remembering that it's now been just 10 years since his passing. Asan was a real private sector leader, not only in Korea, but in the world, and for building the kind of future that all of us would hope for in the world. Korea has come of age. I think that's been indicated by so many things that have happened over recent decades. And as we assemble here, I want all of us to remember how far you have come. Prime Minister Lee, Minister Han, your colleague, Ban Ki-moon, today is the revered international statesman in the world. Korea hosted the G20. You will be hosting this great conference next March. And it is a sign indeed of Korea's coming of age. So, again, I congratulate all my longtime friends here for everything you have done. I'm reminded that in 1982, I had the honor of representing the United States as the public delegate, as an ambassador at the United Nations, at the second special session on disarmament. And those of you who've been in the United Nations know that they have this seating arrangement where countries kind of rotate in terms of who sits in the front row. Well, in August 1982, when virtually the whole world was on vacation, I gave the final speech on behalf of the U.S. delegation, and I looked out at Iran, Iraq, and Libya in the front row. And about the only thing that's memorable about my speech is that all three of them spent my entire 6 minutes hissing at me from the front row as I tried to make a certain point. And the first point I made was one that was not very widely appreciated then, that I think now is being more and more appreciated. And Professor Martin Anderson of Stanford University, recent book on Ronald Reagan, I think showed it and shows a certain continuity of U.S. policy that we should not lose sight of. In Anderson's book, he talked about Ronald Reagan, private citizen, then governor, then president, talking about a world free of nuclear weapons. And he goes into very great specifics about how clearly Reagan had thought this through. And as my colleagues on the panel have already discussed, when they talk about Kissinger and Schultz as Republicans, together with Sam Nunn and Bill Perry, Democrats, coming together, even as Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama express much the same viewpoint in terms of containing this monster, in terms of limiting it, in terms of, if you will, trying to put the genie somewhat back in the bottle. So you will not hear me criticizing President Obama when he talks about a bold dream and bringing reality into the making of a new nuclear policy. Because this, in fact, is a dream of American statesmen in all political parties. I am, however, a conservative. I'm reminded of Edmund Burke's calls for prudence. I'm also reminded of an effort that we've undertaken, as have other think tanks around the world. We did it over the last several years, and you can see it on our website. It's called Nuclear Games. It, in fact, is a game where individuals have come together for several days at a time and played out different roles in terms of possible nuclear accidents or nuclear incidents occurring around the world. And the world in which we live, in terms of proliferation, in terms of opportunities by so many rogue actors, is indeed a different one, certainly from what Reagan faced in '82, and a different one from some of the idyllic visions that those who would push very rapidly toward this objective seem to have in mind. One of my concerns is to ensure, as you mentioned, Minister Han, the need to keep America's deterrence, nuclear deterrence, credible. Not only here in Northeast Asia, but indeed around the world. No, we don't face a Soviet Union across the Fulda Gap in the middle of Europe anymore. But we do face challenges throughout the world, whether it is Ahmadinejad in Iran, whether it is a prospective Syria acting inappropriately, or wherever it might be, and of course just north of the border here. And there, I urge my colleagues in Washington, whether in the media, whether in the administration, or elsewhere, that we must tread cautiously when we talk about, for example, the implication that Tehran and Pyongyang act understandably when they see that Moscow and Washington still have nuclear weapons and that they, in fact, are just trying to join the club. That's kind of dangerous talk, especially if we're trying to reinvigorate and reactivate the six-party talks to tell Pyongyang that they've been acting outside acceptable rules for the civilized community. And it's a very fine line we have to walk. I understand that. And it's one that I very much look forward to discussing and hearing about over the course of the next several days as we meet here. We've seen, and this conference is so important here because, as everyone here understands, obviously, Korea is where all the major world powers come together. China, Russia, the United States, Japan. We're all here on the Korean Peninsula. We all have interests here. And when the ROK asks for assurances from the United States, then the new government, relatively new government in Japan, talks about a no first use policy here, which then kind of escalates to more demands from Seoul in terms of what really is our intention in terms of deterrence, and kind of back and forth. I guess what I would say is that if we, as active, involved public participants, as well as governmental representatives, can leave this conference in a couple days with a few ideas about how to, kick the can down the road carefully, gently, and in the right direction. But with some caution so that we're not undermining something else that's trying to take place, e.g. the six-party talks. I haven't talked about China. We will discuss that in some of the breakout sessions. China represents for the United States a very special challenge. We're hearing right now some very strong calls from retiring Secretary Robert Gates from the Pentagon in Brussels just within the last 2 days. And I suspect we will be hearing from him about Asia in more detail too before he steps down at the end of the month. But it must have been rather disconcerting for a U.S. Secretary of Defense to be calling on counterpart officials in Beijing and having a prototype stealth fighter from the Chinese PLA flying overhead at the same time. It is something that does keep American policymakers, I think, probably awake at night when you think about what's happening across the Pacific and how do we tread that line very finely. I won't go back to Confucius, but I will go back to Sun Tzu, who talked about the best general is the one who can fight a war without ever having to shoot. And we do live in a very, very complicated place. In conclusion, I just say again, as a conservative, change is essential and inevitable. I recognize that. But change for the sake of change, change to curry favor, is not in anyone's interest. In fact, it can be destabilizing. We cannot let a bold dream for the future turn into a dangerous nightmare for the future. So, as we deliberate during the course of the next several days, I hope we will remember that prudence must dictate every activity here. And I know I don't have to remind my Korean colleagues of this because of what they face a mere 35 miles to the north. So again, I thank all of you for inviting us here. I very much look forward to the discussions over the next several days. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Fuller, thank you very much for that. And I think you captured the concerns that many of your conservative colleagues have about the concept of moving to a world that is nuclear free. On the one hand, they want to embrace the Reagan vision, and on the other hand, they think it's destabilizing getting from here to there. We saw this in the previous administration, the Bush administration, when I was White House correspondent for the Times and covering the Bush administration. I asked several times why President Bush never invited the four statesmen to come make their pitch to him. He never did. He saw some of them individually, but never had them all in. And the answer that I got back was one that I'd like to put to you that might get the conversation going here. Many of President Bush's aides said, why would we want to start a conversation that would ultimately lead us to bring our numbers down in nuclear weapons to the level of the Chinese, or maybe the Iranians if they are successful in building something up, or maybe Pakistan if Pakistan continues to build them. And at which point the United States, they argued, would essentially no longer be a significant nuclear superpower, but instead, for some period of time during that build-down, would actually be just an equivalent nuclear power with the likes of Pakistan or China or other states. You've obviously given this a fair bit of thought. How do you get around this problem? How do you get to the sequencing of this in a way that you think could satisfy the concerns you raised?
I guess, first, when in private conversations with several of those involved in making these presentations, with Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, both privately, one of my arguments responding to them was that, in something that they should realize, is that in Washington, inevitably, the urgent overwhelms the important. If you're fighting a ground war in Iraq and you're concentrating on other items like that, these longer-term issues are not going to rise to the top. They're not going to be something that's going to really make it up there. But how do you get there, I guess, is the key question that I've asked them, that I would ask all of you. How do we get there? If, in fact, the United States plays this unique role in terms of not only protecting its own homeland, but acting as a nuclear umbrella, a nuclear undergirding, not only for Japan and Korea here, also throughout Europe. How do you get from that stage to a lower level stage, particularly when, and this might create a bit of a reaction, but particularly when a lot of people in this arena cheat and they don't tell the truth. I think of it, we are certainly as transparent as anyone in terms of our capabilities, in terms of what's out there, and that's a real problem. how we get from where we are to where we want to be is always the key question, David. I can't answer it. I don't have that accumulated wisdom.
Great. Let me ask Minister Lee and Minister Han a variant of the same kind of question. A few months ago, in the midst of one of the concerns inside South Korea about the North, you heard some revived discussion within the South Korean parliament about maybe South Korea does in fact need its own nuclear weapons again. This was put down fairly quickly by the sitting government. But I'm wondering if you could tell us the degree to which that sentiment really exists in the body politic here today, and whether it is partly fueled by the concern that President Obama is committed to eventually, over time, going down to a world free of nuclear weapons, and therefore the umbrella you discussed may be perceived as having diminishing value. Mr. Han, do you want to start us with that?
I think the issue or the idea comes mainly out of frustration that there has been no progress, nothing has been effective in persuading North Korea to give up its nuclear program or weapons. And even those who now urge that South Korea should reconsider about its non-nuclear weapons policy urge the government or the rest of the country to rethink about it, not so that we will ultimately end up as a nuclear power, but as a means to use it as a bargaining means with North Korea and in helping North Korea to give up its own nuclear weapons. I personally don't think that this will work. In fact, it will be highly counterproductive. It will not only give them new ammunition to maintain their own nuclear weapons, and also a very strong argument that they should have their weapons. So I think at the end of the day, I don't think this argument will go very far. And there has been a continuing strand of argument that we should not give up the possibility of having nuclear weapons completely. And now it's being heard a little more loudly again. But both the rationale, the practicality of it, and the consequences of even having a discussion would be so counterproductive, so unbeneficial that I don't think it will go much further than now.
Mr. Lee, you've just heard Mr. Han say that this movement comes out of the frustration that really nothing has worked in the way of sanctions and so forth. And you see that to some degree in the uranium enrichment program that we heard the foreign minister refer to before. That program was revealed by the North Koreans in November. Here we are 7-8 months later. And it's hard to establish that North Korea has paid any price for doing that. There's been no move to the United Nations, been no particularly new sanctions, a few small ones announced. If you were North Korea, wouldn't you come out of that with the lesson that basically moving opposite the trend of the larger powers to build down is a pretty profitable strategy right now?
I agree, and I really agree with Dr. Han's use of the term of frustration, but it's largely frustration not toward the North Korea, but it's basically frustration, first of all, towards China. This is somewhat related to your earlier question about what South Korea would do if we achieve unification under our leadership, about the nuclear weapons existing in North Korea. First of all, to us, at least to me personally, it's somewhat incomprehensible that a great power, and now a great superpower like China, allow a immediate smaller neighbor with less than responsible track record, allow the neighbor to develop a nuclear capability. It's a little bit beyond our common sense. Generally, the superpowers would not like that. Furthermore, the way Chinese are tolerating all this development, some Koreans, out of maybe frustration, feel that maybe Chinese are more or less accepting the possibility that South Korea and even Japan will develop nuclear weapons capability out of frustration. In case of Japan, of course, constitutionally they have given up the military solution in any international conflicts. Nevertheless, when North Korean missiles fly over the Japanese highs, and there is a possibility that those missiles had the nuclear on it, they might rethink about it. So my answer is that we're really asking China to think about this much more carefully and seriously. Is China really prepared to inaugurate new age of power balance in Northeast Asia? By new balance, I mean everybody becoming a nuclear weapon state. Mm-hmm. I don't think so. That's why I would very much like to see the nuclear summit, but particularly the nuclear bilateral summit between China and the United States. Are these two powers really letting the situation like this develop in Northeast Asia? And again, we are very careful about China, but as I said, if we unite ourselves, and I cannot speak for the government or for anybody else, for myself, we'll give up whatever nuclear capability we acquire. Because that's not the way to live with a great superpower as an immediate neighbor. It only spells for trouble. And by the way, looking back the history of Korea, our national strategy has been not to rely on hard power to survive or to secure our proper place in the region or in the world. We will rely on our creativity, in our culture, and in other fields to compete with much larger neighbors. After all, we have only 3 neighbors: China, Russia, Japan. All 3 are much bigger than we are, and we are not in the hard power contest anyway. So my answer is, it's a frustration, but I think we are sending, I don't know whether it's very delicate or not, but delicately to Chinese that consider these things much more carefully, and we would welcome a more positive reconsideration of Chinese position. And going further, we hope that there will be a much more serious discussion between China and the United States on this. And I hope this will be one of the items which will occupy the minds of people who are coming here next spring for the second nuclear summit.
Thank you, Dr. Fullman.
May I just add a footnote? to what Prime Minister Lee just said. Not only does China right now have India, Pakistan, Russia all on their border, and obviously DPRK, the potential of Iran. You just mentioned Japan and the ROK in such a destabilized arena. I'll throw another name in that nobody has dared mention yet, and that's Taiwan. I mean, China all of a sudden could have 10 nuclear neighbors. Why do they want to increase the possibility of still more? And I've asked some of my Chinese friends that and not had very satisfactory responses other than unsettlement on the northern Korean border and do we really want U.S. troops and questions like that. But it's an unsettled situation.
Very good. Well, we have about a half an hour, and we want to hear from all of you. There are some microphones around, so when I call on you, if you just wait for a moment to get the microphone, please tell us briefly who you are and do what you can to make your question a real question. And that would be terrific. Who wants to begin? Sir, right there, and I think there's a microphone right ahead of you there.
Yeah, Chen-Sheng Zhao, American University from Washington, D.C. I would like to join my friends here to congratulate very successful beginning. My question particularly to Prime Minister Lee, when you specifically mentioned the frustration with China, I guess my understanding actually China is equally has frustration with North Korea. I don't think it's in China's interest that North Korea would develop nuclear weapons. So my question to you is, why you think China may be more powerful in terms of checking North Korea, since other powers such as U.S., Japan, Russia could not do that, particularly the United States. So in other words, why you think China should have more influence or more leverage over North Korea? We all understand actually it's a very complicated relationship. Thank you. Yeah.
Just to put an additional point on that, we saw China urge North Korea not to conduct its first nuclear test in 2006. They conducted it. We saw them urge the North Koreans not to conduct missile tests in 2009. They conducted them. And not to conduct a second nuclear test, and they did that too. Does raise the question how much influence they have and what they could do differently.
Should I speak? Well, it's always dangerous to guess what Chinese are thinking about, and but since I'm retired now, I feel a little more comfortable to make my guesses. I think Chinese are basically too busy. So there are so many issues they have to deal with, including many internal problems. That's why, if at all possible, they don't want to be to add a very serious issue, immediate issue to their current agenda. So what they are doing in regard to Korea is basically a kind of holding operation to see how things go and wait a few more years and see how things are going. Now, added to this is, of course, we have to remember the history. After all, starting last year, we are commemorating 60th anniversary of Korean War. For Americans, for example, it was a war in which some 37,000 soldiers were lost, killed here in Korea. It's a big war. But about Chinese, well, it's not just 37,000, it's really in terms of 200,000 or more. So, given that sort of a sacrifice they paid, including the son of late Mao Zedong, for Chinese military and other Chinese, there are many reasons to be rather hesitant to sharply change the policy whereby there is a danger of North Korean system disintegrate or collapse. So we understand all this. But finally, Chinese are too busy, as I said. Quite frankly, I think Washington is too busy too. They have other problems in other areas, like Afghanistan and so on. So maybe Americans too would like to have a kind of holding operation. If nothing happens in the next few months, let's just wait and see how things go. So that's the kind of milieu in which we are operating. But as many have pointed out, including Henry Kissinger, on this issue, on North Korean nuclear issue, directly involved powers are the United States, Russia, China, and Japan. You have two nuclear superpowers in US and Russia. Speaking of the other three, in economic terms, it's world 1, 2, 3. If they cannot solve this problem diplomatically, Henry was saying that there's no need for diplomacy anymore. So what is needed are all those powers get busy and try to find a diplomatic solution to this, and I think there is a solution. Because, as I said, no one wants to invade North Korea. In fact, within South Korea, absolute majority of our population is born after the Korean War. They have more than their share of problems. All our students are now on street demonstrating our tuition is too high. They like to have a reduction of 50%. So they're too busy. It's no time to take care of North Koreans. That's kind of the mood. So it's in a way fiction that the North Koreans are entertaining. That is, others are trying to invade North Korea. No one wants to invade North Korea. So what we need is a real diplomatic solution. But at the moment, as I said, the major involved powers are too busy. And I was saying that the next year's gathering here at least will provide an occasion to think about this. And if at all possible, we can formulate some sort of diplomatic solutions, and which may involve international guarantee the security of North Korean regime and solve the nuclear issue for the sake of Korean people, as I said, for the sake of the security in Northeast Asia. We have more than our share of problem. The situation in Fukushima, the nuclear safety problem added a further complication. So that's the kind of milieu we are operating.
Thank you, Prime Minister Lee. I guess I draw two distinct points out of your answer here. One of them is that there really is convergence between China and the United States because we both have a tendency to kick problems down the road. And I guess the second one out of this is that if we've all learned a lesson over the past 10 years since the invasion of Afghanistan forward, it's that invading countries with broken infrastructure tends to get really expensive very fast. So, other questions in this audience here? Am I missing a hand? Oh, right over here, sir.
Good afternoon. Paul Hughes from the U.S. Institute of Peace, and I also would like to congratulate the Asan Institute for pulling this wonderful plenum together. Sir, I'd like to go back and challenge your assertion about how the United States and China are viewing North Korea and its nuclear weapons development program. I think we're looking at it from the perspective of a nuclear weapon as being a tool of national security and influencing the behavior of other countries in the region and the world. I think that's how people traditionally have looked at nuclear weapons. But I'm not so certain that that is how the North Koreans are looking at it. There is a great deal of discussion in Washington among some experts that this is really all tied to the issue of leadership succession, and that this is very internalized within North Korea, not something about protecting North Korea from an external invasion. So could you comment on the thought that this really is tied to the successful succession of the leadership?
Well, I'm not real expert on North Korea. Nevertheless, I could venture to say yes, there is a strong element there. It's the many of the things North Korea do are tied into what I call system characteristics and system constraint. When you build up a system like North Korea, much more successful and efficient totalitarian system than the Stalin's Russia, the price you pay is that there is no room for maneuver. No one can change anything. I, in fact, doubt if Kim Jong-il himself has very many options. He just has to go on the way he has been doing. And that's why it's very difficult to expect some inertia of change from the inside. It's only the strong influence from outside which will have a direct consequence to the daily livelihood of the system, will have some impact. And in that sense, I still think the Chinese role is pivotal. And we're not trying to give all the responsibility to the Chinese. But that's the current setup. And if at all possible, I think great powers, particularly U.S., should help Chinese to resolve this problem. And everybody else, certainly South Korea included, will try to be some help. So again, I still believe there is a room for much more determined effort diplomatically to formulate some sort of solution and really test it in the coming years. Because otherwise, the whole region could become unstable. And increasingly, as everybody recognizes, this region, the Asia, and particularly Northeast Asia with China and Japan, and now South Korea, we're very important, not just strategically, but even economically in terms of global economy. So to make this region reasonably secure from the nuclear problem is, I think, essential for the regional peace, but also for the global development. But I agree with what you said. Yes.
There was a hand in the back corner there, yes. Just wait a moment, there's a microphone coming to you.
My name is Park Jin-ho, working for Assemblyman Hwang Jin-ha at Korean National Assembly. I think the Korea and U.S. have been working together for more than several decades for dealing with North Korea's nuclear problem. But unfortunately, I don't think we have seen any substantial progress. So I want to ask a question about by working together between U.S. and Korea, what kind of different lesson Korea and U.S. learn in dealing with the North Korea? And I want to answer about the lesson South Korea learned from Mr. Edwin Fuller and the lesson the U.S. learned from Dr. Han Sung-ju, if it's possible.
Sure. Dr. Fuller, you want to start with that?
The first lesson, I think our friends here in the Republic of Korea have learned since this whole problem erupted is that there can be no distance between Seoul and Washington in terms of how we approach Pyongyang. that we must be together in lockstep. And certainly that has been the position in the Clinton administration, in the George W. Bush administration, and in the Obama administration, that we are together on this. And it was not always true on this side of the alliance as we looked at what the challenges were north of the 38th parallel. I think that's been the big lesson that our Korean allies have learned.
Dr. Fullin, you'd agree that during the Bush administration and the administration of the late President No here, they were about as far apart as we've ever seen them. Is that right?
Yes.
Mr. Hahn?
Well, I'm not really sure about the question and why he would ask me about the U.S. lessons that U.S.
All those
learned.
years sitting in Washington trying to figure it out, Mr. Hahn. Yeah.
It probably depends on the U.S. administration. Right now, it happens to be a Democratic administration, which was in government at the time of the first nuclear crisis in 1990s, early 1990s. In fact, we have Gary Seymour sitting here who dealt with the North Korean nuclear issue then and who's now back in the Obama administration dealing with the same problem and, of course, a lot more. And probably he's the one to answer that question than me.
We'll have our licks at him tomorrow, so we'll ask him then.
Well, right now, the Obama administration, as actually the Bush administration did before, that keeps saying that they cannot buy the same horse twice, and in fact 3 times. And so the U.S., I think, has learned the value of having any agreement, particularly with some compensation to North Korea in the process, and what kind of certainties you have to secure before you make any deal with North Korea. And I think the lesson that Mr. Fuller just mentioned about the need to be in locksteps together between the United States and the Republic of Korea, I think that is another lesson not only South Korea learned, but also the United States learned in the process.
There's a question over here, the gentleman in the corner.
My name is Nobuya Sabe from Japan, Japan Institute of International Affairs. I want to bring in a little different aspect to this question, Korean question. It seems the gentleman spoke very often about risk of starting a nuclear confrontation, and consequently they suggested that we should be in a sort of holding position, or we should be avoiding confrontation with North. But I have a little reservation about this view, which is even if you hold the pattern, there is a tremendous number of people suffering in the North, physically or in terms of human rights. And I remember one of the conservative position in Washington is don't just deal with nuclear issues, but also think about the human rights question. And I think there's one human rights coordinator appointed in Washington, but he is not so powerful as the apparently Ambassador Bosworth. So my question is, what will be the conservative prescription for North Korean question today? This is a question to Mr. Fulner.
In fact, Dr. Fulner, I think it's fair to say that you heard President Bush probably talk about the human rights situation in the North more frequently than you do hear President Obama discuss it. He rarely takes up that element of it in public.
Yes, indeed, President Bush did. I would say that concern about human rights is very much a bipartisan belief in the United States. It has become that over the last 30 years or so, in going back to Ronald Reagan's early activity in terms of dealing with President Chun Doo-hwan here and basically saving the then renegade leader Kim Dae-jung. But on and on. I go back to what Prime Minister Lee said about China's role, and the problem is, if China, in fact, the last time I looked at the numbers, China provides, 70% of the energy and almost 70 or 80% of the food to North Korea, and yet threats of withholding seem to have no impact on the way the government in the DPRK acts. All it does is basically deprive the people in the North. How we get an effective set of actions from China that is coordinated with Tokyo, with Seoul, with Washington, and hopefully even with Moscow, in terms of getting Pyongyang into the international community to act in a responsible way, is the big question. And I think China should be playing the lead role on that, again, because of the border, because of food and energy and everything else I just mentioned. Maybe it is just that they are busy in so many other things and worried about economics and other matters. But
gentleman right here. Just wait a moment, there's a mic coming.
Yes, my name is Clark Murdoch. I'm a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. We spent most of the time talking about the vision of disarmament and its applicability. I tend to focus a little bit more on the security side of things, and calling upon Gary Seymour reminded me of that it was another Democratic administration, President Carter, who withdrew U.S. nuclear weapons from Korea. And I wonder if there are security circumstances in the view of both the former Prime Minister and the former Foreign Minister, security circumstances under which South Korea might want to have U.S. nuclear weapons based again on their territory.
This issue also came up in the Parliament just a few months ago, I believe, in the South Korean Parliament. Which of you would like to?
Can you explain what you mean by strategic consideration? Security circumstances, okay.
Under which, for purposes of terms, South Korea might want to host U.S. nuclear weapons again.
Bring back nuclear weapons?
Yeah.
There were discussions. In fact, there are some active politicians who advocate that position. I think there's a question of both the advisability and the practicality of it. And I don't think practicality-wise it is a feasible proposition. As I understand, I don't think the United States is in a mood to entertain that kind of idea, and that would be the decision of the United States to bring back tactical nuclear weapons to Korea. If it does, And at the same time, there's also a question of whether substitute means would be available, and in fact, they are. The only other reason would be if that will persuade North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, which is actually one rationale for that kind of proposal. And it's highly unlikely that North Korea will be persuaded to give up nuclear weapons because the United States brings its tactical nuclear weapons back to Korea.
We only have 4 or 5 minutes, so we're just going to try to go through 2 questions fairly quickly. Sir?
Paul Davis from the RAND Corporation in the United States. I guess my question is whether you can imagine a plan B where maybe a president or maybe a prime minister emerges that says, you know, I've been thinking about this, and it's just not plausible that these bad guys are going to give up their nuclear weapons, so let's not talk about it anymore. It's just not sensible for the superpowers to talk about reducing their nuclear weapons down to the level of a Pakistan. We've got to do something else. What then would be the strategy that would hang together?
And at this point, having a president who has stepped out and embraced this as a long-term concept, I think that would seem like a serious reversal of direction. Dr. Fulman?
I guess at that point it would be incumbent on CSIS, on RAND, on Brookings, on Heritage, on a bunch of others to figure out where we go from here. And I don't know that that's in the cards politically in the United States. Looking at the way the stars seem to be aligning in 2012. On the assumption this is always going to be a presidential determination. I mean, the Congress can weigh in and emphasize or de-emphasize, but the leadership on it will obviously come from the White House. And in either assumption, a re-election of President Obama or an election of any of the major Republican candidates, I can't think of any of them, in fact, reversing. So I guess it's one of those unknowns that is just out there. It's a known unknown.
It is interesting that when you think about how much these issues were debated in presidential campaigns, in the Cold War era, I don't think I have heard a single one of the Republican candidates right now who have announced take up the issue of this nuclear issue at all in any of the cases.
Mitt Romney did a year ago at our place.
That's right. A year ago and has not since.
No, that's not correct.
We're just going to grab one last question and then wrap it up. Is there any last hand out here for a quick? Yes, way in the back.
Peter Beck from Council on Foreign Relations. If North Korea has in fact concluded watching Iraq and now Libya and for its own regime's survival that it's in its best interest to keep its nuclear weapons, then should we be considering capping their program rather than trying to ban it and abolish it? Is that a worthy undertaking, or would that be a fool's errand?
A shift to containment. Who would like to answer that? Mr. Lee?
I'll let the
Mr. Han.
Dr. Han.
Okay.
You get all the tough ones.
Well, certainly we can't do that officially and explicitly. I'm afraid that in some ways that has become our meaning the rest of the world objective for the time being, and wait for the next opportunity to come, whether it's a change in the circumstances or the parameters which would allow further drawdown or even removal of nuclear weapons. I just want to take this opportunity to say that we see so much change. Back in 1993, when North Korea declared it was withdrawing from NPT, we thought the end of the world was coming near, and there was so much reaction, and not only in terms of our thinking about it, but also in things that we did, and now North Korea has declared it has nuclear weapons. North Korea has tested nuclear weapons twice. It has demonstrated and also declared that it is promoting its nuclear uranium enrichment program. And here we are in a sort of wait-and-see, benign neglect, or what former Prime Minister Lee says, too busy attitude. And not only among the general public, but also by the various governments, including the U.S. and the Republic of Korea. So it looks like, to cap it, seems to be as much as the governments seem to be looking for, than the so-called CVID, the complete dismantlement of the nuclear weapons of North Korea.
Well, thank you, Minister Han. Thank all of you, and thank everyone on the panel. And I think we got this off to a good, if somewhat dispiriting, start. And I look forward to each of the panels we have in the afternoon. Thank you again.
Thanks, David. Very nicely done.
Thank you.
Wow, that was good.